Thank you very much for sticking out and waiting for me to come up as the last person. You'll be glad to hear this afternoon. It's been absolutely wonderful, and it's a real privilege to be here. I'm here today to talk about my work as a poet and also about my current collaboration with a visual artist, Philip Musson. We're exploring the sacred sites of the Ards Peninsula and the Lougheel Peninsula and the strip of County Down that borders Strangford Lough, kind of linking these two areas. And how archaeology has been hugely influential. I'll be talking about with the development of my own writing practice. I have been writing poetry since I was a very young child, although I had no notion that it was going to play such a huge part in my adult identity. What I did want to be when I was a child was an archaeologist, and this may have been slightly influenced by the Channel 4 series Time Team, which I watched obsessively for a long time. And I shared every week in all the excitement of what the comedian Eddie Izzard described in one sketch as the uncovering of a series of small walls. Every week, it was great. And I even managed to amass quite a large collection of colourful stripy jumpers in homage to Professor McGaston. So this desire to be an archaeologist continued for a number of years until I realised that actually archaeology involved quite a large amount of science, at which point I figured my path might lie elsewhere. So my writing follows two quite distinct processes, one which is a felt emotional response to a situation, and the other which arises from hours of research and intellectual engagement with a subject matter, a process of contextualisation and distillation. Of course, each process informs the other. And what I'm searching for, and will continue to do so, is what Sylvia Plath would describe as, in a slightly sixth formy way, as the thinginess of the thing, the capturing of an essence, unanthropomorphized, as I write in one of my poems called Totem. So I'm going to read you Totem, which is the final poem in my first collection, which is published by the Dara Press. They're a small independent publisher based on the west coast of Ireland in Connemara, and the publication of that book was supported by the Arts Council in the north and in the south of Ireland. So I'll read you Totem, and hopefully, if I'm pressing the right button, why isn't this moving? There, that's an image my partner Philip created for the piece. I'll read you Totem and then I'll pick it apart a little bit afterwards. In the museum was a pine trunk, 8,600 years old, standing totem tall, unanthropomorphized, a signifier only of itself. Nearby, smaller sections, oak 4,000 years, and elm 5,000 years, had been dug from the bog, placed on a plinth, brought, startled, into their light from their soft, dark sleep in the peat. I stretched out to touch what had been wrought in darkness, rubbed my fingertips and palms swiftly across the distortions of the piece, texture like hardened butter from the fridge, and realised the polish I felt had been given by other furtive devotions by other visitors, unable to resist reaching out to the wood, to feel what otherwise would never be known. Later that evening, after several single malts, you lifted the antique woodblock mould of the acanthus down from its display in the rented cottage. We kneaded the grain with olive oil from the kitchen, then pressed the cheap clay we'd bought into its writhing form. Days after the clay had dried and you had your cast to bring home, I continued to slip my fingers into the crevices of each leaf's inverse curves, gazing from my windowed desk at the mountain's southern flank, where the shades of clouds continually passed, and where, below, the sun glinted intermittently on the black waters of the loch. Now, a couple of years ago, Philip and I visited Connemara National Park whilst we were on holiday with our children. And other than conquering an amazing trail to the top of Diamond Hill, which we are all quite sure should really be named Diamond Mountain, we also explored the visitor centre at Connemara National Park, where there were some really beautiful examples of bogwood, which had been brought out of the bog by local archaeological excavations. And what I'm trying to articulate through the poem is a move away from an anthropocentric position in the world to something more actively engaged with materiality, and to express the shock of suddenly coming into contact with something which is so utterly familiar and yet so completely itself. It has no need for human intervention to invoke its inherent power. In the first verse, the bog oak is looked at and even touched, and I wasn't the only one touching it. And there is a realization that the power lies entirely in the fact of its own existence. It has no signification other than itself. It is standing totem tall, but it is not a totem. It is representational only of itself. So the second verse goes on to talk about how later that night we lifted the antique woodblock mould down from the shelf of the acanthus. There had already been mention of several single malts, so our engagement with the situation had been, well, it's not exactly a derangement of the senses just yet, but it's definitely a slight removal from that impact of the bog oak in the museum. We have the acanthus mould, which is made of wood like the bog oak, but has all sorts of human intervention tied up with it. The mythology around the acanthus symbol itself being the Greek symbol of death and rebirth. The fact that it is a woodblock mould, so the actual image is in reverse to how it should be presented. And also how, because it's an antique, it has been removed from the practical life it was intended for and placed on the shelf and is now purely an aesthetic object, at least until we got our hands on it. And it's displayed in a rented cottage, which is a transient place, and we have no ownership of that space. So we took our mould with the clay and very carefully cleaned the mould afterwards and put it back up. And I finished the poem by talking about looking through the window, again a matter remove, and watching the clouds, but not really the clouds, it's a shadow of the clouds moving across the flank of the mountain, and I'm not looking at the sun, I'm looking at the sunlight on the water. So these various stages of removal that are talking about human intervention with the impact of materiality, this removal of the self. Now I could claim some sort of vague and undergraduate-y allusions to Plato's story of the shadows on the wall of the cave, which is probably in there somewhere within the process. But what I'm actually trying to get at is how outstandingly stunning things are in and of themselves without the need for human intervention of the layering of narrative. And that is the core of my approach artistically with the world. It's a world without supernatural inhabitation to give things value. Things are incredible in and of themselves. The human need for meaning which comes in the placing of a human self at the centre of experience by intellectualising and constructing rules and rituals, only removes us from a true lived connection and meaning, which is how I represent myself at the end of the poem, removed and essentially observing myself removed, but hopefully aware and moving towards the honesty of the initial experience with the archaeological bog oak. The problem is, of course, I'm a writer, and so no matter how infatuated I am with things being unanthropomorphized, I am compelled by the simple act of writing, by the fact I use analogy and metaphor in order to give depth and breadth to my writing, to change the thinginess of the thing. But what I hope the change is the acting of the thing on me and not the other way around. So this is why working with a visual artist is great. Conveniently enough, one of the most relevant phrases to Philip's visual arts practice is by the artist Cy Twombly, who talks about the thingness of the thing, which is very strangely similar to Sylvia Plath's thinginess. And we made the decision to collaborate on this project we are currently working on, almost accidentally. We've always loved visiting ancient sites together and came to realise that those sites were causing responses in both our arts practices. So over the last year, we've been working together in a more focused, directional sense, putting together this exhibition, which will be exhibited in Ards Arts Centre in May. And it's, so visiting various sites on the actual Ards Peninsula. I really should have got a picture of the area, sorry. The Ards Peninsula and then the inland area inside of the Strangford Lough. and there will be a chapbook which will be produced to go along with the exhibition. And the exhibition is called Beneath the Mantle. As I mentioned, the act of writing, particularly with dangerous tendencies towards intellectual abstraction as poetry, can certainly undermine the intention to examine an object as a thing in and of itself. But visual art has a very different presentation. Even when the work is abstract, in fact, especially when the work is abstract, there is nothing like the same level of obstructive narrative and ego to distort the view of what's being represented. This is an image of Leganani Dolmen. Leganani is about 3 miles north of Castlewellan and in County Down on the slopes of Slieve Croob, and it's probably the most photographed megalithic monument in the north of Ireland. This tripod dolmen has a capstone over 3 metres long. At its highest point is about 1.8 metres, and it dates to the Neolithic period, so it's about 4,000 to 5,000 years old, but you know that. So what's very particular to Leganani is on the winter solstice, the sun rising hits the underside of the capstone and then the point of the highest point on the supporting stone. Philip has made two different images of Leganani. There's this representational image, which you see now, and then one which is much more abstracted, which you'll see shortly. There are two very different experiences, or two very different responses to one experience. For my response to Leganani Dolmen, it was much more difficult. I found I had too much information, which was getting in the way. So for all my research and considered response, when it came to writing the poem, I could know the various translations of the name. I could know all about dolmens and how they'd been originally covered with earth, with a cairn on the top, and maybe the body inside. I knew all these considerations of archaeological evidence. I knew that Lord Francis Ainslie had sent a photo of the dolmen as a reader's submission in 1895 to the Journal of the Royal Society of Antiquities of Ireland. But what I didn't know how to do was write the poem. So what I did was I wrote a few very embarrassing things, which are now thankfully disposed of, and then I left it for a while. What came out in the end was a poem more influenced by my felt experience of Leganani and not the research knowledge. But I couldn't have written the poem unless I had the research knowledge to step over or step around. It informs but doesn't clutter. I'm not trying to prove any intellectual point or show off how much I know. So our totem is a statement of a philosophical standpoint as a humanist, taken from an engagement with an archaeological site. Leganani is a poem of something quite different, and I'll read it to you now. I wonder who will be an orphan first, me with my father's diminuendo in the home, or you with your mother the way she is. We visit both, her house, little, mean, wreathed in smoke so thick it hangs viscous in the air like wood smoke on a frozen morning, but not really. It holds nothing of that comfort and hope. At the home, the staff have helpfully decorated the hallways and lounge for Halloween. Grinning skeletons taunt the residents who choose not to notice, pretend, wistful for hollowed turnips to leer at death instead of this glittered invitation. We escape, drive, then run up that hill far off. There where the hedge veers off in shock, flayed naked and unaesthetic by cutters, some farmer recently dragged along the track, perched omnipotent in his tractor cab, stands the dolmen. It should be hidden beneath the earth, this structure, instead of the exposed animal splay, but we circle it, gingerly stroke the stone, afraid of what it may tell us of our existence through our hesitant touch. You photograph it, crawling under whilst I admire the view. Dolmens and drumlins, it's what we do when we need to breathe. It all rolls away before us. Slowly, I lean back, rest my head against the rock. So this poem was published in Strick's journal this summer, I'm obliged to say. What is similar to totem is that the experience of the artefact shows that it is so much more substantial, much more real in a sense than I am in the world. There is a gravitas there to both the wood and to Leganani, which comes from being very old. So this gravitas and this presence and my lack of in totem is demonstrated by my telling of my withdrawal back from the window and back to shadow watching. In Leganani, it's emphasised by the syntactic structure, the way I phrase and punctuate the poem. The beginning is made up of short phrases, lots of commas and pauses to give a sense of breathlessness, of being disjointed and disconnected, as I talk about dealing with the complications of family. The people in the nursing home, including my father, are also very old, but have none of that centeredness of the dolmen. But as we approach the dolmen, the phrases lengthen, the language is less hard. It shifts from lots of hard consonant sounds, the Ks and the Ts and the Ps, towards some more soft and sibilant sounds of drawn out S's and R's. I'll show you Philip's second Leganani image. We both are fans of Vicky Cummings, the archaeologist who writes a lot about multisensory archaeology, about the use of texture in Neolithic monuments. So I think you can see the influence of that there in Philip's work, and also the impact of the winter solstice on the capstone, if I want to take a little bit of the abstraction away. At this point, I'm going to make a Terry Pratchett reference, and I apologise. I mentioned before that the dolmen seems more real than how I feel my place in the world. And Terry Pratchett talks in the Discworld. Sorry, does anyone else read Terry Pratchett? Yes, thank you. Terry Pratchett talks in the Discworld novels about how the ancient monuments which populate his landscapes seem to bend reality or are more real than the world around them. And he describes his stone circles and standing stones as being like lead weights on the rubber sheet of reality. And this is because of their thingness. The dolmen is not the same as the boghook. The dolmen is intentional. It is a human comment on the landscape, or as Wittgenstein would have it, a gesture in the landscape. It is symbolic. It is a big I am. It is, to quote Walt Whitman, a barbaric yarp. Something is being communicated, but it is something more than a burial chamber or a portal tomb, because of the way it calls the landscape to it, because of the way the stars spin overhead on its axis. The polar star is directly above Leganani Dolmen, so all the other stars, all the other constellations rotate around it. It is because the sun strikes the underside of the rock at midwinter solstice, and how on that side of that mountain the whole county is embraced and laid out for inspection. And that is the thingness. Its placement is an intentional action, but the dolmen holds to itself all that is offered up by that intention. Or as Durkheim would express it rather more sensibly in The Suicide, the social fact is sometimes so far materialised as to become an element of the material world. Another poem and art pairing from the same project comes from the shores of Strangford Lough, nearby to Mount Stewart. It is not strictly speaking a sacred site, but the potency of the experience there resonated strongly with what we're trying to achieve with the project. On Strangford's shore. It was almost not there, its existence so slight that the fact you noticed it on the very vagrant edges of that seashore seemed to confirm its place on the teetering brink of memory before the wash came in. You showed it to me, and when I knelt to have a closer look, the shells and unjagged glass clinked and settled into new positions in my pockets. We knew it must have been spotted before, and could so easily have been mistaken for a simple hollow in the boulder, spattered with remarkably Wallian gull guano, the scat of those birds staining the pock-marked rock pale over the flight paths of time. But that is not the reason for the crenel and the white. You read the message from the past there, saw the fire, the iron, the socket where the molten metal could harden from what was fluid into what was sharp and fierce and cold. This small corner of the Strand was not a place of sands and tides to you. When you looked, you saw the flame, the work, the steady pour of ore raising sparks up into the sky. So I'll not go into I'll not go into an analysis of that at all. So I'd like to finish by reading two final poems. And one is from a series of poems I'm writing about tools as a way of exploring work and working class life. And this is to do with, well, my father, who's in this nursing home with Alzheimer's and dementia, not being one to do things by half, after working for 40 years in a local aeroplane factory. And my son, or our son, who's 12, and is entering a world where, at best, is hostile to the working class male. So I wanted to create a series of writing which looks at the role manual labour has had in development of art and culture and celebrate it. It's about creating a thing. And then the second piece, I wanted to look at the ontology of an object through its myth and its practical use. And I'm going to read that one first. And it also mentions Ballyvester Standing Stone, which looks like a megalithic monument. It stands just outside of Malisle on the Ards Peninsula, but actually was placed in the 1920s as a monument to a local sea captain. And I'll read that poem first very quickly. An oar and a winnowing fan. The geography would have confounded Odysseus had he come with his oar to Ards and wished it mistaken for a winnowing fan, a task doomed to failure in a land of seas and hills as waves, where one land ends and another begins only 18 miles from shore. He could have walked, zigzagged the peninsula from end to end, and asked miller and sailor both, what is this tool? What is this tool? And beneath the 600 spinning sails of 150 white windmills, by the harbours of hundreds of fishermen's craft, he would be answered, it is both. It is both an oar and a winnowing fan. Lash the hero king to the Ballyvester Standing Stone on the sudden brink of drumlin and sea. See what voices will come to claim him there. And I'll finish with this one. Needful things. The epidermis of whales is stripped from the carcass like the skin of an orange, round and around in long single pieces. The hunting down of those creatures with antler harpoons seems improbable, but Mesolithic men who had no knowledge of orange peel contextualise their actions. In freezing winds, soaked on the shore beneath the stern pines, blankets of blubber would anticipate the warmth of burning oil and flesh, and the people worked the dead thing as though their lives depended on it. Their lives depended on it. They looked from sharpened bone blade to fallen branches scattered about, and saw them hafted together, bound with strings of tendon and gut, matlocks for the butchering, which became slippy with the fat and blood of the work. It is through flesh and blood the things which are necessary are known, the making of heat, of light, of food, the hafting of the needed with the needful thing.